This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
All right, here we are on Beyond the Big Screen. We're back doing Mafia movies, or we're still doing Mafia movies. And a big shout out today goes to Amma, who is a listener who suggested this movie of The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight is based on a book of the same name by author Jimmy Breslin. It's a comedy film, you might call it, based very loosely on the life of our old pal, Crazy Joe Gallo. The movie is a comedy, like I said, about a group of bumbling and bungling mafiosi who can't seem to do anything right. And there is this just about every single stereotype you can imagine about the mafia and Italian Americans. You have the Italian grandmother, the slick mob bosses, the low-life foreigner meme, in this case played by Robert De Niro in one of his very first roles, and much, much more. I am joined, as usual, by none other than Mustache Chris, the possible reincarnation of Chris Rosenberg of the Gemini Gang. Mustache, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good. A bit tired, been busy at work, but other than that, I'm doing pretty good.
Well, let's talk about this movie of The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. It's very interesting. It came out in 1971. And I believe it was released in December of 1971. And Joe Gallo got whacked in April of 1972. So it only came out about 4 months before Joe was whacked in New York City. And then you have the other movie that we talked about before, the Crazy Joe movie, which was made just a little bit after Joe was murdered, about a couple of months to a year. So I think it's really interesting how these two movies sort of bookend the end of Crazy Joe's life and his career.
Yeah, I would say that. And I don't know, it's pretty, like, the relationship between, like, Orbach and Joe Gallo was pretty fascinating when you think about it. Like, he does this movie that he, takes inspiration from Joe Gallo himself for the character, and then he's whacked 3 months later after the movie comes out. Like, it's, I don't know, it's pretty mind-blowing when you really sit down and think about it.
Yeah, so that is an interesting part of it. Jerry Orbach of Law and Order fame, he's also was a huge actor on Broadway. He played Salvatore Kid Sally Palumbo, and Lee Taylor Young, who wasn't in very much that I've ever seen. She played Angela Palumbo, the sister of Kid Sally. And then Robert De Niro played Mario Trentino, which we'll get into all of that. But maybe, Chris, just for the people who maybe didn't listen to the Crazy Joe episode, really in broad strokes, who was Crazy Joe Gallo?
Yeah, Crazy Joe Gallo, he was like a pretty higher up guy in the Gallo crew, or the Gallo brothers crew in the Colombo, it was the Perfacci family at the time. And Joe Perfacci was being extremely cheap in terms of the payouts that he was giving to Gallo and his crew. And they were making a fair amount of money. And Joe Gallo and his brother decide, like, we're just not putting up with this anymore. And they try to take out Joe Perfacci, and they fail at doing it. Or they kidnapped his henchmen. And this goes on for quite some time. The five families, they have a sit down with all of them. The five families say, this is an internal family matter. So the war continues. Joe goes to jail. And when he gets out of jail, he says, well, a peace agreement was reached, and Joe says, "Well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I never signed it." And then the war starts up again. That's pretty much it, right?
And then, like we said earlier, Joe Gallo was killed in a restaurant on his birthday in 1972, and that's pretty much it. I think that one of the things, though, with Joe Gallo is, and if you people can tune in, we're going to talk about the book Wise Guy and the movie Goodfellas. Henry Hill, the famous rat, you might call him, on the Mafia, he uses that as the Joe Gallo is one of his bookmarks of when the Mafia sort of went off the rails, because it was so out of the realm of possibilities, and it was so crazy that Crazy Joe would take on an entire family.
Especially the Profaci family, because they were like Mafia royalty, really. I mean, I've been reading a book, Joseph Bonanno's memoir, or his own, his own autobiography that he wrote himself. And I'm not going to lie, like, just listening to this guy talk about himself, I kind of understand why Joe Gallo was a little fed up. I mean, like the way that these older conservative Mafia types kind of viewed themselves as a little, I don't know, it's a little bizarre to me. Like Joe Profaci and Joseph Bonanno were good friends too. But Joseph Bonanno talks about like the rise of Joe Gallo, and it was something that was simmering for quite some time, where this new generation of mafioso that were more American than Sicilian were coming about, and were questioning the old Sicilian ways. I mean, you can see it. It started with Lucky Luciano and like Meyer Lansky, and Meyer Lansky wasn't even Italian, let alone Sicilian. And there was this power struggle between like the new way coming in and the old way, and Joe Gallo basically blew the doors off of it, and it was never really the same ever since.
Somebody like Joe Profaci, you have to remember, like you said, he was royalty. He went back to the time before Lucky Luciano and Genovese and those guys, and he's really tapping into that Sicilian thing of the country and the village, where everybody in the village knew each other, and you kept your damn mouth shut about everything, and you lived a pretty low key life as much as you can. And then you have somebody like Joe Gallo coming out of the scenes, who's brash. He's a city guy, and he loves the city, and he loves, patting people on the back and being a big name. And that plays into this movie, where it's the behind the scenes of the movie, where Joe Gallo started becoming friends with actors and artists and musicians of the day. And he became a close personal friend of Jerry Orbach from this movie. That was something that those old Mustache Pete's and the Joe Profaci types just found absolutely just off the wall insane.
Yeah, like the more conservative, I guess you could call it the conservative wing of the Mafia. A lot of these guys didn't even really want to deal with non-Sicilians. Like if you were like a Neapolitan or from like a different region in southern Italy, they really, for the most, if it was up to them, they really didn't want to even deal with these guys. And here's, Crazy Joe is hanging around with actors and, dealing with hanging around with African Americans. If you listen to the Joe Gallo episode we get into that in more detail. It's it's just a really, really wild time. And but I mean, listening to this Joseph Bonanno book, it's just, I can understand where like Joe Gallo and some of these guys are coming from, where it's these old kind of mustache Pete's, where they're almost delusional about what the Mafia is actually about. Like if you read like Joseph Bonanno's book, you'll get this impression. First, he like denies that he was dealing drugs, and he talks about like our tradition, and you would figure like just reading his book, like everything was just like kind of legit. Like they weren't doing anything really illegal. Like we were just doing a little bit of bookmaking and some bootlegging, and we had nothing to do with prostitution and drugs. And it's just like, it's all like, if you actually knew, you'd be like, what are you talking about? Like who are you trying to fool here? I can only imagine being somebody like Joe Gallo and trying to deal with these people. And they were also incredibly cheap. That's all these old kind of mafia guys were incredibly cheap to their own crew. I guess maybe because that's the way they came up. They just figured this is the way it should always be. But I mean, Joe Gallo's the one taking all the risks, not Profaci.
They really did. Those old guys, it was an expectation that the smaller guy kicks up a big chunk of the money to the next in line. And I think that some of those older time guys, it almost got a feeling that they had this romantic notion of how things were done in Sicily, and they wanted to carry it on in the US. But it was completely detached from any reality, and it was detached from their own reality. Look at people like Genovese and Luciano. They were breaking all the rules, getting into prostitution, getting into drugs. Luciano was big into the drugs. I think there was some of those older guys that they just couldn't handle. I think that the world had changed, or at least that they wanted to maintain this romantic reputation that they were honorable criminals.
Yeah, men of honor is what they were referred to themselves as. And I mean, I'm assuming, and that's always been a thing in the mafia, is that the bosses or the higher ups always kind of called themselves that. But I mean, not even, we'll probably get into it later, but like the French Connection and like the Sicilian drug trade, like that's this Sicilian like drug trade was massive, like in terms of it was narco level. And I mean, still, even to this day, it's really big. Like, for a lot of these guys, these older guys to talk about like to turn their noses up to the drug dealing, it's just not reality. Even back in the old country, this is what they were doing. Like they were shipping out massive amounts of heroin. Like I don't know. I can't wrap. I don't understand their perspective. I really don't. Where like Joe Gallo is like, I mean, who are we kidding? Like this is what we do. Like we're criminals. Just pay me properly. This is all I want.
Exactly. Joe Gallo had no pretensions. He was a criminal. And he loved it, honestly. Like you could see when he would talk and he would go in those Senate hearings, like with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth, wearing Ray-Bans with the slicked back hair. He was who he was, and he didn't want to mince any words about it. He was a new brand of criminal.
Yeah, and even like I've just because I've been reading the book, like like Bonanno's in there, like he would say stuff like, "Oh, I didn't know that Carmine Galante was like dealing drugs." And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like he was one of the biggest heroin dealers in the history of the United States. Like what? You didn't have any clue whatsoever why he was bringing over these Sicilians that you hold in such high regard. Like they were literally just getting brought over because they were good at dealing drugs. Like,
yeah,
it's a little tangent. I know it's not so much related to the movie, but it is in the sense of there was a younger generation coming up that was disillusioned with what the older generation was talking about, or at least what they thought Mafia was.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. That does have something to do with this movie, though. I think that Joe Gallo's gang, in a lot of ways, broke a lot of the rules of the Mafia, but in also his plan to take out Colombo and Joe Profaci didn't work. And a lot of it, in a way, it was because they did bungle it. So this author, Jimmy Breslin, he was a famous writer in New York City at the time in the 50s and in the 60s. He writes this comedy book called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And I haven't read the book, but I've read some reviews of it. And apparently it's pretty funny, and it comes off a lot better. I think from what they say that Jimmy Breslin had a real sharp wit in his writing, and it came across as pretty funny. Some people, if you read it now, will say that the book was kind of dated and it doesn't really carry on. And I think before we start diving too much into the movie, I mean, to be quite honest, there's not much to dive into this movie, but I think watching it for me, and I'm interested to hear what you think about this, Mustache. I think that there was something maybe in the 60s people in the 60s maybe thought this was funny, but it does not translate into the middle of getting onto the middle of the 21st century.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I mean, there's some funny stuff in the movie, but a lot of it is I'm watching it and I'm just kind of scratching my head where I don't understand. I don't even understand exactly what they're doing, because we talked about it earlier, but like just the acting. And me and you've talked about this before. Like I'm a fan of overacting. So for me to go, this is too much. It says a lot. Like I guess the extreme stereotypical portrayal of like Italian Americans. I guess, I don't know, in the 60s, maybe this was funny to people, I guess. Like, and not to, say like, oh, this is like bad or whatever. It was just too much for me. Like, it's just, I don't know. I just didn't find it. I didn't find the movie generally some of the stuff was kind of funny. Like I thought the grandmother was pretty funny. I thought Robert De Niro's character was pretty funny. He's like this new immigrant coming over and he's just a crook. I don't know. Like that would probably never get there's no way that would get made nowadays. But I thought he was pretty funny in the movie. I mean, some of the gags, I guess, are kind of funny, but I don't know. The tone seemed it was uneven to me, where it seemed like it was trying to be something like kind of like in the style of Naked Gun and just didn't really do it very well.
I got to me, the flavor of it, and Roger Ebert, I think it was Roger Ebert said that it was trying to be like the Pink Panther, the original one from the 60s. And that was, I could see that it could have been going in that kind of style of the Pink Panther as kind of a jokey comedy with a drama element, but it was just so corny. And the stereotypes, I mean, I know that they liked in the 60s to like turn stereotypes up to 11, with the wasps in Green Acres and with the Irish and different things. And even with Bruce Lee and what was that one that he was in? Oh my goodness. He was in the Green. Was it the Green? It wasn't the Green Lantern.
Green Hornet. Yeah.
The Green Hornet. And you can see why, but they turned up the stereotypes on Italian Americans and like the whole mafia culture to 21 instead of the 11. The first probably 5 minutes of the movie is every character saying "hey" to each other. Hey. But I would say for the first maybe 10 times they did it, it was cute. By about the 50th time they did it in 5 minutes, I was very close to just turning off the TV.
Yeah, I was watching it, and I think a couple of days ago, I'm watching it, and I'm sitting there, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, how are we going to do a podcast on this? But we're doing pretty good so far. Yeah. Like it's one of those movies. It sounds a lot cooler when you're reading about Joe Gallo. It's like, oh, look, they kind of based a movie on him, and and then he was killed 3 months later. And then you watch the movie, and it's like, this movie's not very good at all. It's terrible.
Well, the character played by Robert De Niro, I guess watching it from a modern perspective, I think it's cool to see Robert De Niro in one of his earliest roles. I think he had only done maybe 2 or 3 movies before that. 1 was uncredited and 2 were small. So this was, from all appearances, is kind of his first big-ish movie. he played an Italian American or an Italian immigrant from Calabria in southern Italy, which Calabria was always really traditionally poor. So when they saw all these scenes of him stealing things, or he wasn't even stealing big things, like he'd steal all the mints out of a restaurant, the bowl of mints, or all sorts of, like, constantly stealing food. I think that would play in the 60s because that really was a stereotype of somebody from southern Italy from like the early part of the 19th century, maybe up into the 50s, after World War II. But today, I mean, I know people who were from Calabria, and they didn't exhibit any of those roles whatsoever, or any of those stereotypes. Like, they were from it was like the one woman I knew, she said it was kind of country-ish, but it wasn't like they had to steal to eat, or they weren't eating,
Yeah, and I mean, watching this movie, you can kind of understand where like Joe Colombo's Italian Civil Rights League comes about, because you watch this movie and the stereotypes are just pretty brutal. And it's a little shocking at the time when you're watching it, because you're thinking to yourself, it's like, you hear people talking about like people stereotyping Italian Americans, and most of the time, like, we think of it, like our generation and like modern times, we think like, they're just like kind of poking fun at like the way they, just their exaggerated emotions, I guess, to a degree, and like family. But you're watching this movie, it's like a mob, it's about the mob, and it's like made funny, and like the grandmother's like a murderer. It's like I could kind of understand where like it is shocking. And I mean, Joe Colombo's like Italian Civil Rights League kind of makes a little bit. It doesn't seem as ridiculous when you watch this movie. It's like, yeah, I can kind of see where he's coming from.
One of the things that I thought was really bizarre too was it just wasn't. I don't think it was funny. I don't even see how somebody back in the 60s, like maybe Italians or Italian Americans, could kind of find the satire in it. No, that's kind of like my grandmother. But I think that wore out for me within the first 10 minutes of the movie. Like, it just, the overly religious, the boss, Don, I can't even remember his name. It was so silly, but yeah, the one who's modeled after Joe Profaci. They do this one gag with him where his wife starts his car and she says like a Hail Mary before she starts it, so that the car doesn't blow up. What did they do that 5 times? It's just not good comedy. It's not funny.
I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna lie. I actually, out of all the gags that they did, that was the one I kind of liked because they did it so many times. They just kept on going at it, and after I watched the movie twice, and then the second time watching it, I was like, yeah, I would say this is probably one of the better gags that they did. But the problem with like this whole movie in general is you mentioned the Pink Panther, and there was like a dramatic element to it. There's really no dramatic element to this movie at all. It's like they thought it was a cool, let's do a movie that's kind of loosely based around Joe Gallo and the Colombo Wars that were going on at the time or had just finished, and that was it. Like, that's all they had. Like, they didn't really think about, like, oh, let's fill out these characters a little bit more, let's give it, something for the audience to really care about. They just kind of ran with that joke and decided like, oh, let's just do a whole movie based on that. And that's not really how good comedy works.
And then the drama element, or I think the element that they could have captured something with is with Kid Sally's sister, Angela, who is portrayed as this more modern girl, young woman who she's going to NYU. She's not involved in the family whatsoever as far as the mafia goes, and the mother of her and Kid Sally really prefers Kid Sally over her, which is a common Italian American stereotype of the mama's boy and the mother. But that, I think they didn't carry that through, and it in the end it just fell flat, and it didn't really pull on any of your heartstrings. It didn't make you think about anything, and it wasn't funny either. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, it just didn't really go anywhere. But I'll say without her in this movie, it would have been just what you're talking about. It would have been just the same jokes again and again. And she's actually the one that gives you a little bit of relief from the over the top Italian stereotypes that are just repeated ad nauseum. She's the only relief you get from that.
And did you notice at the end, she started talking with almost like a broken English when she was talking to the Robert De Niro's character. There was one speech where she was speaking in broken English, like with an Italian accent. I'm like, she didn't speak with that throughout the entire movie, and now she's doing that. It was another thing that was just completely inexplicable, and it seemed like Kid Sally would talk more and more as the movie progressed with a broken English, when he didn't talk like that in the beginning. I didn't know if that was something they were trying to go for, or it just made no sense whatsoever.
Probably filmed it earlier, those scenes, and said, like, well, let's try it this way, and it didn't work, and then they changed it, and then they just never fixed it. That's probably exactly what happened.
So it was definitely something, because clearly Joe Gallo, he was born in America, and that was his whole thing, is that he was an American gangster.
Yeah.
So they're missing that. And I think that was maybe the more interesting part of his sister, is that she was an Americanized Italian from this Italian mafia family. And she's our link to, quote unquote, mainstream American culture. And she's sort of she should be our window into this crazy world of the Italian American. And in comedy, she's the straight man. And it doesn't make it all just falls apart.
Yeah. And if anyone thinks we're being like particularly hard on this movie, I mean, if you just go look it up, and it's got less than a 5 on IMDb. So we're not the only ones that don't really think this movie is all that great. I mean, the story behind the movie is far more interesting than the movie itself.
Yeah, I would agree that is definitely the fact of Jerry Orbach becoming buds with Joe Gallo. And wasn't it, there's some, at least rumor out there, that Jerry Orbach was supposed to be at Joe Gallo's birthday party, at Umberto's Clam House, where Joe was whacked.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing. And like, there's detective, I believe, Paul Coffey, I was reading an article, was pretty convinced that like Jerry Orbach had a pretty good idea of who did Joe in, and he just wouldn't talk. Like, that's crazy to me when you think about it. Like, apparently Jerry just, he didn't rat. I don't know. He didn't snitch or anything. Like, after his good buddy just got whacked. I mean, like, to me, that's the most fascinating part about this movie that got made, is like, it's a comedy movie about loosely based on events that just had recently happened. And the main actor is friends with the guy who was the main participant in a lot of the stuff that went down. Movie comes out, he gets killed 3 months later. And like, the mob is just entering this phase of, like, Roy DeMeo is just around the corner, and like, Gaspar Picasso and Richard Kolinsky, like, we've talked about 2 of those guys already. And the mob takes this kind of real kind of psychotic twist. You know what I mean? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, it is really bizarre. Like, we're watching like a slapstick comedy about the mob, but it's not a slapstick comedy about the mob 20 years after they put John Gotti in the slammer. It's just the more psychotic part of the mob is coming just right around the corner. Like it's not really funny. And Italian Americans are the ones who suffer the most from the mob for the most part.
It really was the movie was filmed at a turning point. Like I think that's what you're saying, is that you almost could see the jokey element to the Mafia in the 50s and the 60s. Sure, they were killing each other and that sort of thing, but it turned into, in the 70s, of they're killing each other constantly and over coke and heroin, and they're dealing pills, and they're, well, you'll see when we eventually talk about the movie Wise Guy, or that was the book Wise Guy, the film Goodfellas. Even in the description that Henry Hill gives us, a lot changed over even his career between the 50s into the 80s. It definitely got more psychotic.
Yeah, and it's, like right before it, you have like this funny slapstick comedies where it's just like, oh, it's kind of funny, guys. Like, look at these bumbling mafioso. And it's like, what, the same mafioso that's going to be, like Roy DeMeo, just dismembering bodies in like almost a factory like environment. Like to me, it's really bizarre. I mean, maybe somebody can message us and try to explain it better, because to me, I just find it really bizarre, because we're right in the middle of it. And like when this movie came out, and like the mob, everyone knew the mob was a thing. Like the McClellan Committee talked about it, Joe Velocci had talked about it. Everybody knew that the five families were a thing, the commission was a thing, like the mob was running big parts of the United States and doing a lot of murdering and a lot of crooked stuff. And we're just going to release like a slapstick comedy about it. Like, it's just, I don't know. It's really bizarre to me. Yeah, not to belabor the point, but
I can see where you're getting at too. It's not like something like Blazing Saddles that takes sure, there was a lot of really rough stuff that happened in the Wild West. I mean, people shooting each other, and things against Native American Indians, things against, happened to women and African American people. And I mean, you name it, just so much bloodshed. 100 years later, yeah, you can make a slapstick comedy out of that. But yeah, when it's happening, for sure. That's kind of a hard thing to do.
It's a hard thing to process, because it's like a cliche thing in history, but it's the truth. Like, the further you're removed from a particular event, like you're able to make jokes about it and think about it more objectively, right? Like Genghis Khan's like conquering, we see it as like, oh, look at how big his empire was on the map. We don't really see, the thousands and thousands and, probably millions of people that died to create that empire that was that large. But, it'd be like, I don't know, Genghis Khan, and then I don't know, like say people in Russia doing like, let's make a slapstick comedy about like the events that just literally happened 10 years ago. Like, it's very difficult to understand.
One thing I will say though, that there is a place for edgy comedy. You think about like Team America, that one with the puppets from the guys who made South Park. Like, that was a really edgy comedy in the middle of the war on terror. I don't think that people in the 60s were really watching this. I think they truly didn't understand, unless you were really in that life or were in places like New York City, where you were much more in it and inculcated in it, maybe is the right word. I'm not sure. But if you were living in the middle of Nebraska or something, and all the stereotypes of the mafia, then I think you could get it and not have it on the edgy side. But I don't think the 60s late 60s, early 70s audience were ready for something that was really edgy comedy.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Yeah, you brought up Team America. That's a good example. Or even Doctor Strangelove. That's a little bit more closer to when this movie came out. It was basically a dark comedy about nuclear holocaust.
Yeah.
I mean, we mentioned in the notes, like maybe they could have went in that direction and done like a dark comedy with this instead of something, I don't know, lighthearted, because that's really what it is. It's a lighthearted comedy.
I think that's maybe where we could start talking about is how you make this movie better. Say you were going to try, and I think maybe that it could be a movie you could try and remake today. I think it has to be, because what the movie was really, it was slapstick comedy. To me, I think the real mark of slapstick comedy are the Naked Gun movies from the 90s, where it's really cutting edge. They're really pushing the envelope. I mean, a lot of you watch the Naked Guns today. I think it's even more edgier today than it was back then, because they're with the quote unquote wokeism, if you want to call it. A lot of the jokes that they made on the Naked Gun, you could really not make today in a major motion picture. So I'd have to say that if the gang that couldn't shoot straight, if they maybe went more in that direction, I think it could have been a lot funnier.
Yeah, and it would have just gave the film a better direction of what it was actually. I think that's what it really wanted to be, and I don't know, it didn't go full into it. I mean, to be honest though, like the Naked Gun, like that style of spoof was pretty revolutionary at the time. Like nobody really had done that. I don't even know how to describe. They call it spoofs, right?
Yeah.
But it really is kind of its own thing. Like Naked Gun, and I believe the show is called Police Squad. Mm-hmm. Really kind of created that genre of comedy itself. I mean, and they came out, not like significantly later than when this movie came out, but I mean, you see it in this movie where it's just like, oh, just why didn't they just do Naked Gun? And then you remember, well, yeah, Naked Gun hadn't come out yet, or Airplane, or
they weren't. I don't think that the audience in that time period, I mean, I think the Airplane would have come out maybe 10 years later ish, in the 80s. That was a different world. And I think a lot of things had changed after Vietnam, where people are a little bit more cynical. In 1971, I don't think people were ready to see like the full on Leslie Nielsen spoof, where, you're really sacrificing a lot of sacred elements of the culture. They were not ready for that when this movie came out.
In terms of, like, we were talking about, like, did you have to be born in the 60s to really get this? I mean, I use an example. I really enjoy the Hangover series in terms of comedy. If I was to take like the Hangover trilogy and just drop into the 60s, not only they just wouldn't understand it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm not talking about like the cultural references. They just would not understand that comedy. They would be like, what am I watching?
I think it goes the other way too. Well, obviously we dropped this movie into our time today in the 21st century, and I don't think most people get it. But I also think about if your grandmother watched this movie, I think my grandmother would probably think it was pretty funny. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
What I've noticed it with, like, it's truth though. Like, I've noticed it with, like, just, older people, like grandparents and, people in their 70s, late 60s, and they're laughing at stuff that they're watching on TV, and I'm watching and I'm like, this is terrible. Like, I don't understand. How are you laughing at this? And it's a generational, like, cultural. They're able to laugh at things that are way less, like, I guess I would describe it like less cynical, I guess, and less dark, or I need that in my comedy. Like I need it to be dark. I need it to be over the top. We've talked about this a lot. Like I'm a big fan of um, Kenny Eastbound and Down and Danny McBride and that style of, I guess it's called like cringe comedy or tragic comedy. Eastbound and Down is probably what he's most famous for, but he's doing the show right now, Righteous Gemstones. He did another one, Vice Principals, and it's a mixture of like tragedy and comedy, and people in their late 60s, 70s they just wouldn't understand it. Where I'm sitting there, I'm laughing and I think it's brilliant. So
or the comedy that came about in the 80s, 90s that just took on everything. The Andrew Dice Clays and the Sam Kinnisons, that they really, and to some degree, you're seeing some comedians come back around to that, where if it's something that people hold sacred, they're just going to eviscerate it. And I don't think that was a type of comedy that was not for the general audience, at least at that time. People were starting to really get into Rodney Dangerfield and Henny Youngman, comedians like that in the 60s and the 50s. But that was a niche audience. That was not what was going on the major motion pictures at the time.
Yeah, I mean, and I do like some lighthearted kind of like, I like Bob Newhart. I think Bob Newhart's hilarious because he's just he's telling a joke, but doesn't look like he's telling a joke. Like I like his shtick, and he's not really cynical. He's does pretty like lighthearted comedy myself. You mentioned like people coming back and doing the more kind of edgier stuff. There's a guy right now, Tim Dillon. He's pretty. He's like in that style, and he's getting pretty popular. Where he'll just, doesn't matter what it is, he'll just take it on. Right wing, left wing, religious, not religious. He doesn't. He just says whatever.
And I think in the end, like, you could appreciate that type of comedy. Like, just for an example, the Pink Panther, it's entertaining. This just did not carry through with it. If it had just tried to be more like the Pink Panther, I think it could have succeeded. It was just every element of it just failed.
Yeah, I mean, and then you have like an actor like Robert De Niro. Like, I get that he hadn't done a lot of things at that point, but I mean, literally like a couple of years later, he's in The Godfather 2 and he's doing Taxi Driver. I mean, this is what you could get out of Robert De Niro. It's just the people involved in the film were not very talented, or just didn't have an eye for talent.
And Jerry Orbach being a huge Broadway star, he hardly has any lines. Yeah, I just said
that's the craziest thing. He's supposed to be the main guy, and you're like, and when I'm watching the movie, I'm like, okay, how am I supposed to be emotionally attached to what's going on right now? Because this guy, he hardly ever talks, and when he talks, there's like 5 or 6 other people screaming, and I can't even hear what he's saying.
And each one of those, it just progressively goes through one thing after another of them, of Kid Sally's gang failing to kill the mob boss. And there was elements that could have been funny. I think this was one that you had mentioned, and I thought it was funny, where Hervé Villechaize, which it's interesting, he was a small person of the day, and he was in both this movie, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, and he was in Crazy Joe too, which I thought was interesting. But so he has a gun, and they don't have the right bullets to go into the gun, and so he's taking the bullets that are too big for the gun, and he's hitting them in with a hammer into the cylinder, and then he hands that gun to Joe. Joe he has the gun up to the boss's head, and it explodes in his hand. And it could have been funny. I'm laughing at it right now because it was so absurd. but it wasn't funny watching it.
To me, it was one of the better jokes that they did in the movie, because like Robert De Niro's character is there, and the mob boss thinks he's an actual priest, and he's like, "Oh, thank God," yada yada yada. And I thought it was one of the better setups that was the best setup that they did in the movie. I thought, in my opinion,
don't you?
Because it was just funny seeing him hammer the bullet into the gun and then just hand it to him, and you know what's going to happen.
And they set that up so masterfully. I think they set it up and then it just failed. Like, I think, like you said, relatively speaking, that was one of the funnier scenes in the whole movie. But it didn't, I mean, I didn't laugh out loud or even chuckle at it. But I think like if they had done that well, you'd be rolling on the floor laughing if somebody with a little more talent had written that out. Yeah,
like the people that were involved in like Naked Gun had done it. They would have been able to like just do it slightly different, and it would have been really funny. And in this movie, it just kind of, I mean, I kind of laughed. I don't know. I kind of smiled a bit, but I wasn't like laugh out loud. At no point in this movie was I like really laughing out loud at any of the jokes.
It's not like I'm some sort of a grouch watching the movies. There was a movie I was watching just the other day and I was in tears watching it, laughing. I think this had the potential for that. That's maybe what's kind of the saddest part of this movie. I think it did have the potential. One thing I think that it probably had the problem with is it could have done some spoofs of The Godfather, but The Godfather didn't come out till about a year later. So it really didn't have, it was in a way blazing its own trail.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about how to make the movie better. I mean, I don't know. Did anybody think about just asking, "Hey, Joe, do you want to be in a movie?" Like, that would have been cool.
I think that would, and he would have done it too, I bet.
Well, 100. Yeah, he probably would have had a fun time doing it too. Like, I don't know. He's like just one of the mob guys or at one of the scenes or something, like, why not just have Joe in the movie?
Or like a simple thing, like they're walking down the street and they bump it. Jerry Orbach bumps into him and he turns around and says, "Hey," like carry that joke through. And that would have actually, I don't know, been funny. This almost seemed, it could have been a lot more funny if it wasn't in a whole movie. It was maybe a skit on Saturday Night Live or something. I don't think Saturday Night Live had come out yet, but and maybe some sort of show like that sketch comedy show that they had at the time. If you had boiled it down to its essence and done a 10-minute thing, it could have probably been a lot more funny than it turned out being an hour and 40-minute movie.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I mean, you brought up the skit. Like, there's been like a couple of skits that worked really well on, say, Saturday Night Live, but don't translate to a movie very well. And like Night at the Roxbury, I'm thinking that as an example where it was funny as a skit. I do not want to watch an entire movie of Night at the Roxbury. I've watched it, and a lot of people think it's hilarious. I've watched it, and I thought, this is just terrible. It works for like 10 minutes. Like 10-minute skits. Like, maybe they could have done, let's just say in this universe that Jerry Orbach's on Saturday Night Live, and this is like a skit that he does, and it's like a 10-minute skit that they do on Saturday Night Live, and every skit ends with him not being able to kill the mob boss. Yeah, it probably would have worked. It would be funny. But for an entire movie, it's too much. It just doesn't work.
Now, moving on, we're going to move on from the gang that couldn't shoot straight into some other gangs that shot a little straighter. So definitely keep your eye out for those episodes. We'll be talking about a lot more Mafia movies and other movies too. So if you have Mafia movies you'd like to hear about, other movies you'd like us to dive into, we'll be getting into them a lot more. And definitely tune into our live stream so you can get these episodes a lot earlier. And definitely like us on Facebook, go over to YouTube and check us out there. And we will definitely talk to you next time.